Damaged Defenders by Scheherazade. Chapter 27. Loki, Jarvis, and Thor. Loki had been managing fairly well thus far. It had helped that there was so much to distract him. The battle, the cleanup, playing about with things in Tony's lab. It had all helped Loki to, well, not so much ignore as defer dealing with the shit that had got flung his way over the last year. It had also helped that he had managed to avoid actually sleeping the entire time. But not even the great and mighty Odin Allfather could escape sleep forever, and Loki was not he. Loki had no idea how long he'd been deprived of sleep before being sent to Earth, but the night Logan brought the two teens to the tower to stay, Loki lost the battle to stay awake and sprawled out on the bed in his quarters, asleep almost before he hit the pillow. The asteroid was desolate, an expanse of rock and dust and rough-hewn caves. What little atmosphere there was burned his lungs, making him hack and choke and gasp for air that he was not going to get. The heavy chains shackled him to a rock beneath him, forced him to kneel with his nose but a scant few centimeters from rock, the press of his legs against his abdomen further constricting his ability to pull in what little air there was to sustain him. Hunger gnawed at his belly. He did his best to ignore all this, to pull all his attention inward. His mind had become a ferocious battlefield, his stubborn determination against Thanos' sheer power. Despite his best attempts, Thanos was winning. More and more of his mind, his defenses, were falling under Thanos' attacks. He had been forced to withdraw almost all of his attention deep into his mind, burying what little there remained of himself in hopes it would be protected and go unnoticed when the inevitable happened. Then one of Thanos' minions approached with a long, thin object in his hands. Loki took no notice at first until fire erupted across his back, yanking his attention back out of his mind, away from the battle there into the outside world. The minion held some sort of whip, the end tipped with viciously curved, sharp bits of metal. Now that it had Loki's attention, it snapped the whip again, and fire erupted once more as the metal dug into Loki's back. Then again and again, it went on what seemed forever, until the rock was soaked in his blood, dust forming the macabre sort of mud with the moisture, until he screamed. Loki woke screaming and thrashing in the bed, twisting and writhing so violently he tipped himself off the bed and hit the floor with a crash. Still locked in memories, he scrambled backwards madly until he slammed into the wall, then curled in on himself, shaking violently. Jarvis, of course, had no need to sleep. He watched over Sir and the others in the night, knowing that many of them, actually all of them, had things in their pasts that could and would disturb their slumber. He noticed Loki's distress instantly. He did what he had always done for Sir and spoke up, calling Loki by name. This tactic had always woken Sir from his nightmares. Unfortunately, the tactic was not a success with Loki. When Loki woke on his own, he showed no signs of recognizing his surroundings. Jarvis immediately applied to the one person he hoped could reach Loki. "Thor," he called, turning up the lights in Thor's room to waken him. Thor woke almost instantly, sitting upright in bed and looking confused for a moment, then figured it out.
"Jarvis?"
"Thor, Mr. Ferguson is in extreme distress. He suffered from a nightmare. I was unable to wake him. He has since woken on his own, but shows no sign of recognizing his surroundings." Thor had been halfway to the elevator by the time Jarvis had gotten to the part about a nightmare. Jarvis opened the elevator door and sped it to Loki's floor as he explained. Thor had been a warrior for a very long time, so he, by necessity, slept but lightly. Thus, it was easy for Jarvis to waken him, though Thor was temporarily confused as to his surroundings. The tower was yet unfamiliar territory to him. Jarvis's news had Thor moving at speed for the elevator. He had feared this, feared it, and acknowledged the inevitability of it. Thanks be, Thor had some idea of what to do, as Loki was not the first person in Thor's acquaintance to fall prey to ill dreams driven by the brutality of war or memories of capture and torture by the enemy. Given the Aesir's long lives and even longer history as warriors, such a malady was fairly commonplace. He found Loki in one of the bedrooms on his floor, curled in a defensive ball and pressed flat against the wall. Eyes wide and wild and unseeing, one hand half raised and deliberately glowing with barely restrained magical power. Thor immediately crouched himself, aware of how much larger than Loki he was even when they were both standing. With Loki curled in a ball on the floor, Thor knew he would seem to loom over his brother, which was not the best idea. He cast around in his mind for a way to reach Loki, then abruptly smiled, despite the situation, as an idea occurred to him. As young children, when they had yet been all but inseparable, before Thor had met the Warriors 3 or Lady Sif, he and Loki had played many games together. One such had been to create a sort of fake language between them, a collection of words and phrases that only they knew the true meaning of. In the fullness of time, they had added to the language, as Loki had seen its worth as a way for them to communicate on the hunt or the battlefield, with no other the wiser as to what they were saying to one another. Sadly, eventually, they had ceased to use it as they grew more and more apart. But Thor remembered it, and it would serve well, he hoped, to bring Loki's attention back to the here and now. Translated into proper speech, Thor's words were thus: "Come, Loki, wake now, for Aunt Premier has taken a new batch of cookies out of the oven. If we go now, we may yet be able to steal some while they're hot." Thor tried his best to pitch his voice lighter, closer to what it had been when they were children, to complete the ruse. For a miracle, it worked. Loki gave his head a sharp shake, his eyes cleared, and after a moment the power glowing around his upraised hand abated. He focused on Thor and scowled at him as he lowered his hand. "Thor, you sound ridiculous," he rasped out, his voice sounding as if he had screamed, his throat raw. Thor smiled at Loki. "It worked," he pointed out. "I cannot how silly I may sound if it spares you some distress." If there was anything more jarring or ridiculous sounding than Thor attempting to imitate a child's falsetto voice, Loki had yet to encounter it. Despite that, he glowered at his brother. "I need not," he started, only for Thor to interrupt him, face quietly serious in a way it so rarely was. "Brother, how many of our fellows have you seen fall prey to this very malady?" he asked. "There is no shame in it. You need not pretend to be unaffected." The worst part of it was Loki wasn't really in any shape to fake being fine anyway. His hands were still shaking. Still, he couldn't quite help protesting anyway. "So, what, you will lie with me then to guard my sleep?" he scoffed. "If that is what you need to help keep the dream demons at bay, then yes, I will do so, and gladly," Thor said. Loki stared at him in disbelief. "We are not children any longer, Thor, to sleep in each other's beds." Thor snorted. "So we shall make play that we are," he said, and then got to his feet long enough to pick up Loki before Loki knew what he was about and turned to deposit Loki on the bed. Thor grabbed up the blankets that had been thrown aside in the throes of Loki's nightmare and settled them on the bed once more. Thor wanted very badly to hug Loki when he scoffed about Thor helping him. Damn the Allfather anyway for bringing them to this. Thor plonked Loki down on the bed and grabbed the blankets. "Do you remember when we were small and the Allfather told us of the realm of the dead as a bedtime story one night?" he asked. "It was I that climbed into your bed that night, frightened of the dark and the demons awaiting us there." The look on Loki's face said he did indeed remember. "Mother yelled at the Allfather for over an hour over that," he said, sounding amused, "and we slept in the same bed for more than a week before either of us was comfortable in our own beds in the dark." Thor nodded as he settled next to Loki on the bed. "Aye," he said. Once he'd settled, half sitting on the bed beside Loki, who had also pulled himself into a mostly seated position, Thor continued to talk. He reminded Loki of happier days and amusing incidents. The Allfather was spoken of only sparingly, and combat not at all. Thor even avoided talking about the hunts they'd gone on as adults, instead only focusing on their earliest attempts, when they had come home with bruises and laughter over mishaps, but seldom any meat. The whole thing bore a more than passing resemblance to their habits as young children, sitting up in bed after they'd been tucked in, talking excitedly about their day until exhaustion had finally taken them. When, some hours later, Thor realized that Loki had fallen asleep once more, his heart lit with a fierce joy. For Loki to fall asleep again in his presence after such a dream meant he had taken comfort in Thor's presence, that he trusted Thor still, despite everything. Thor grinned happily and kept right on talking. Loki woke for the second time with a jerk, instantly aware that he was not alone in the room. It took some moments for him to take stock of the situation. He was in bed, and he was sweltering, fully clothed beneath the blankets, and with a very warm, very large body tucked close behind him. It was the large arm that had been thrown over his waist that allowed Loki to remember the full events of the night before. The nightmare, and Thor telling stories for hours until Loki's eyes had gone heavy and he'd fallen asleep despite his best attempts not wanting to have to deal with another nightmare. Yet it would seem he had slept through the night, apparently aware on some level that he was safe. Now, if only Thor was not a cuddler in his sleep! He had never been so, even as a child. Even when they slept under the stars during a hunt or battle, anyone that lay within 10 feet of Thor would have a high chance of finding themselves entangled in Thor's grasp come morning. It had been one of the few things Thor had gotten teased about over the years. I know you are awake, Thor, so stop pretending to be asleep, Loki groused. Behind him, Thor chuckled and slowly untangled the two of them. How did you know? You sleep but lightly, Loki pointed out. You would have awoken ere I first stirred from slumber. You also snore when you sleep. I do not, Thor objected with a grin. That was an old, well-worn battle between Thor and the others that oft accompanied him. They all claimed he snored. He claimed he did not. You do, brother, and I mind you that I now have ways to prove it. Midgardians have many ways to record things, Loki pointed out. I will prove to you once and for all that I am right. Thor laughed. As you will, brother, as you will. Then he sobered somewhat. Loki, if you ever wish to speak of... He shrugged a bit awkwardly. Whatever be it that plagues your dreams or aught else, I will be glad to listen. Loki regarded him for a few moments, then nodded. I mayhap take you up on that, Thor, but not this day, he said. The dream was still too close despite the stories and the friendly teasing. And if you have need of me in the night, I will come, Thor added. Loki shook his head. I would not take you from your lady thus, he said. Thor smiled. We do not sleep in the same bed as yet, Thor said. I care for her greatly, but I will come to know her a bit better before we share our bodies in that way. And even if we did sleep in the same bed, she would not begrudge you. She has spoken of you frequently in the last few days and is concerned for your welfare. Loki wasn't sure he'd ever get used to that. To people caring about him. Somewhat belatedly, something occurred to him. So, last night, you never once referred to Odin by name, or called him father. You only ever spoke of him by title. Thor understood the question Loki did not ask. No father of mine would perpetrate such cruelties on a defenseless child, Thor said. Unfortunately, I cannot repudiate him. He will not live forever, and when that day comes, Asgard will need a new king. And you are the only son of his blood, Loki said, understanding. Without Thor, the succession would be in contention, and there would doubtlessly be much bloodshed before a successor took the throne. Mind, brother, I have plans, as I did when we were but children, Thor said. Loki blinked at him in surprise because Thor's plans for the throne when he had been a child and involved the both of them rolling together. You still... More than ever, brother, Thor said. You have ever been the more diplomacy-minded of us. I know war, and how to wage it. You, brother, know far more of peace, and how to maintain it. How to woo allies, win friends, and intimidate enemies without resorting to war. Between us, I avow we could unite all the realms under a banner. Then Thor grinned. Besides, think on how it would make the Allfather writhe to know you ruled Asgard as my equal. Loki couldn't help it. He threw back his head and laughed. And here he thought he was the ambitious one when Thor was harboring such dreams, uniting their realms and spinning in the Allfather's eye. He had misjudged Thor, clearly. I think I like the way you think, Thor, he said when he was finally able to contain his amusement. And I look forward to that day.